You are listening to a free version of the Majority Report with Sam Cedar. To support this show and get another 15 minutes of daily program, go to majority.fm, please.
The Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
It is Wednesday, January 23rd, 2019. My name is Sam Cedar. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America. Downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Associate Professor Tressie McMillan Cottom, author of Lower Ed, The Troubling Rise of For-Profit Colleges in the New Economy, and her latest, Thick, and other essays. Also on the program today, 2 votes in the Senate. Hopefully we'll start the road to opening the government, but don't count on it. Meanwhile, food pantries for the Coast Guard, IRS walkaways, domestic violence shelters understaffed, and more. Meanwhile, the LA teacher strike ends. Denver tees up theirs. And protests turned violent in Venezuela. Is U.S. fomenting a coup? Trump is at an all-time low now, and Medicare for All is at an all-time high.
Good polls.
Meanwhile, Maine governor rejects former Maine Governor Lepage's Medicaid work requirements. And finally, it makes sense. Rudy is drunk.
I knew there was something beyond just him being a terrible person.
What?
There had to be something else.
New York State Reproductive Health Act passes, signed, and protects a woman's right to choose no matter what those a-holes on the Supreme Court do. One state down, 49 to go. Joe Biden made some paid speeches to support a GOP candidate. That will not be taken well by people in the Democratic primary. And a new study. Corporations use charitable donations to help themselves deregulate.
What?
You don't say.
All this and more.
It's called synergy.
On today's program.
Because I'm smart.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's right. It's because, we have talked about that a little bit in the past. There have been various, I just remember a very explicit example sticks out in my mind. The NAACP, I think, came out and was fighting against the soda regulations in New York City. And there was an argument, I guess, that perhaps you have food deserts, and it was you have a food desert, so it's tough to find non-sugary drinks in bodegas, and but it was always rather strained. And now there's been a researcher who has sat down and taken and done a massive study that to find the correlations between nonprofits, which sort of oddly weigh in on regulatory questions that they have seemingly no reason to, and the massive contributions they get from those corporations.
There's a consulting firm called Dewey Square Group, and they're used to be really big. I think they're still in the mix, but they used to have all of their principals worked for the main Democratic candidates in 04 and 08. Michael Wally, I think, is the guy who founded the group, and he's a field guy from Boston. But one of the techniques that they pioneered was getting people who had community leadership reputations to lobby officials essentially like in an AstroTurf capacity. So it would be like a second order, like I'm from the community of concerned whatever, and I want to talk to you about the soda ban, but really they're working an indirect contract for the beverage manufacturers.
Right.
And so that was like the corollary of that, where they had a goal almost of like, frontward, the NAACP endorses something that doesn't make any sense. And then on the back end, you might be being lobbied, but not even necessarily realize it as a public official.
Right.
That's so bad.
Yeah. But it was very upsetting for some of the more philanthropic to find out that that's why they spend their money. But we will talk more about that.
Shout out to Non Giodardis.
Yes. We will talk more about that as we get later in the program. However, we've mentioned, I've top-lined. Look, there's tons of stories out there. I'm sure many of you have seen them. They're individual stories of federal workers who are, deciding, choosing between insulin money and electricity or food for their kids. You have IRS employees who are skipping work because of hardship, and they need to either go work part-time somewhere else, or they can't get to work. Coast Guard Commandant said that members of the armed forces should not be expected to shoulder the burden of a partial governmental shutdown. There is Coast Guard folks having to go to food pantries. We're seeing this across the board, and never mind, I don't know how you measure the anxiety that's created by this, and the ripple effects. I saw a story the other day talking about how the damage that's being done in some of the more sensitive areas of our federal parks. It will take decades for it to recover, because some of these, there's a reason why they tell you, only walk on the paths. But the Trump administration and family, they care, ladies and gentlemen. Here is Lara Trump. She is Eric Trump's wife, on sitting down with Kerry Sheffield, who, of course, is the founder of Bold TV, and on Bold, talking about that very, very issue.
So in terms of the workers who are coming to work and not getting paid, what would you say to them?
Listen, it's not fair to you, and we all get that, but this is so much bigger than any one person. It is a little bit of pain, but it's going to be for the future of our country, and their children and their grandchildren and generations after them will thank them for their sacrifice right now. I know it's hard. I know people have families, they have bills to pay, they have mortgages, they have rents that are due.
I've read about
it. The president is trying every single day to come up with a good solution here. And the reality is, it's been something that's gone on for too long and been unaddressed, our immigration problem. If we do nothing right now, it's never going to get fixed. This is our one opportunity. So I would just tell them, please stay strong. We appreciate everything that you're sacrificing. We are behind you, and we're going to do everything we can. I know the president is doing everything he can to resolve this quickly.
Yeah.
That's bold.
She just nodded. Yes, that was good for her.
It's just important that everybody remembers that this is not about one person.
That's right.
That's the most important takeaway, is that this has nothing to do with an individual, highly disturbed person's individual needs and whims.
I honestly
could not be further from what's happening.
Look, you've got 800,000 people, right? And then plus you have, I don't know how many tens of thousands of contractors, maybe more, that have been impacted by this. That will probably be impacted even more severely in some respects, because they may never get repaid for this, for the loss of work. And I'm trying to figure out some type of algorithm of how many of those people actually would, if they were sitting as the third person in that group right there with the founder of Bold TV and Eric Trump's wife, if they would nod their head in agreement, yes, I understand. It's bigger than me, and it's really about the future. My grandkids are probably going to thank me so much, because there might be 1/60th funding for a wall that will never get built if this ever gets resolved.
They're using this. She's using the sense of urgency that should be used right at this moment for climate change to talk about demographic.
Oh
change.
yeah, to help
Right.
the Chinese. Yeah, way to give up the store, Matt. Totally sad, totally unfair. We do. I mean, I know Barbara Ehrenreich is now on this, and obviously, it's been in the air for a while. But I mean, we got to look at some type of general strike action. It's insane.
Yeah, well, there's been a lot of people actually have been calling for that, particularly for the TSA. And
but just across the board,
and they can't,
this thing is just totally unacceptable.
They can't replace them with scabs because there's no money. So who's going to work for no money?
That's right, and it's also
checks in the mail.
Theoretically, you're right. You need a little bit of training, right? Like the whole theater of.
I was going to say that part I don't know about.
Right.
I think anybody
I don't know.
TSA training would be like, hey, you want to be really annoying?
I flew
Tell
this
people
weekend,
to take
and
their belts off.
What about the air traffic controllers, huh?
Exactly.
Oh,
yes,
definitely that.
I can do that.
I
scab it for.
I flew this.
Hey, look at Matt.
I flew this weekend, and I made a point of saying to the TSA folks I saw, "Thanks for being here." If I was you, I'd just walk out. And there was a little bit of they're not going to talk that way, but there was a little bit of a little head nodding, a little bit. Well, thank you.
Next time I fly, if this is still happening, I'll thank them and say, where's the future?
Right.
Guys, commandeer the sound system at least, guys. Put on some
Oh,
good
they
music.
did that in some airports.
I'm pretty excited about this ad read because this is a company I have been pining for some of their furniture. In fact, I have designed. I mean, look, a little bit of a hack, but people know I do a little bit of woodworking, and I have designed some pieces of furniture based upon this stuff. There's a lot of mid-century modern type of furniture you can find here. I don't know if you've heard about Joybird. It is the company behind the revolution in online furniture shopping. Joybird offers one-of-a-kind furniture made to your unique taste. You can turn your ideas into reality with hundreds of styles and options. From mid-century modern to contemporary classics, all customizable in an amazing array of fabric choices, from rich, buttery leather, plush velvets, to every color imaginable. There's even a wide range of kid and pet-friendly upholstery available. You can also use their free personal design consultants to nail down your perfect design. And with Joybird's 365-day home trial, you can skip the furniture store and bring the showroom home. Sit on it, sleep on it, break it in, and if you don't love your Joybird, return for a full refund. In-home delivery is hassle-free. They'll even remove all the packing materials. And returns are free within 2 weeks of delivery. See how Joybird is revolutionizing online furniture shopping. Create the furniture that brings you joy today at joybird.com/majority. Go to joybird.com/majority and receive an exclusive offer, 25% off your first order by using the code majority. Head over there and just check out. I mean, you check out the couches, obviously, and all the other, and they've got some pretty fun of those spinning seats, but like the mid-century modern media centers, those are the ones that I love. The sliding.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, they're pretty cool. All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, professor of sociology at Virginia Commonwealth University, author of Thick and Lower Ed, Tressie McMillan Cottom, when we come back. We are back. Sam Cedar on the Majority Report on the phone. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program Assistant Professor of Sociology at Virginia Commonwealth University, Faculty Associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, author of 2 books, Thick and Other Essays, and Lower Ed, The Troubling Rise of For-Profit Colleges in the New Economy. Tressie McMillan Cottom, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Sam.
So the for-profit college stuff fascinates me, and the way in which you came about to write of the for-profit college university world is also pretty fascinating. Just let folks know, how you decided to focus on that.
Well, the story is probably less about how I decided to focus on it and why it was possible for me to be doing this project. And I probably started this in 2010, that I seemed to be the only one who kind of wanted to do this project. And I think that is about my personal experience of the for-profit college sector. But I also think that speaks to the fact that there are so few people like me who had ever touched that sector of higher education who were also in that traditional academic world. And so what happened was I was in graduate school, and listen, Sam, I was going to do anything but this project. I wanted to actually study Ronald Reagan, if you can believe that, and instead end up doing this project because as I was working on my doctoral work, for-profit colleges were experiencing this phenomenal boom of enrollment. They were taking in billions of dollars every year from the federal student aid system. And when you start talking about numbers in the billions, people tend to start paying attention. And there was a lot of media scrutiny. There was some growing political scrutiny of the for-profit college sector. But to my mind, there had not been sort of a critical engagement with not just why for-profit colleges were so profitable or so popular, but about who they were enrolling. And I knew a little bit about who they were enrolling and why that mattered because I had, before I had gone to graduate school, I had worked in the for-profit college sector myself as an enrollment officer. And so my experience of it was shaped very much by understanding that not everybody was vulnerable to the for-profit college machine, and also that it was a machine and that we probably needed to better understand why millions of people all woke up at one time and decided that they wanted to pursue a college credential at all costs. And when you went to the for-profit college sector, at all costs was the key term.
And it was almost, literally at one time. In 2000, you had about 400,000 people enrolled in these for-profit colleges. By now, it's over 2 million, is my understanding. So let's just give us a sense of what we're talking about, because you have 2 different types, broadly speaking, that you discuss
right.
And you generalize it by calling the beauty school and the technical, I guess it is. Wait, I had it right here. And so tell us what this is and how their funding mechanism works.
Right. I use these as 2 archetypes, and I had experience in actually what I call both of the subsectors of for-profit colleges. So one of the things that I think kind of got lost in our lumping all of the institutions together was a misunderstanding that 2 different sort of phenomena were happening. So on the one hand, you had what had been the sort of historical role of for-profit colleges, which was they mostly provided career technical certification and training, right? And so that was the certificates that you need that were just probably below a college degree, maybe even below a 2-year degree, but that you needed to become certified in an occupation. So that is a mechanics training, cosmetology school. Those had grown out a little bit into things like what we once used to call maybe secretarial programs, and now tend to think of broadly as administrative or business assistant programs. And then this growth into the healthcare sector. And so things like a certified nursing assistant. That's all of these sort of short-term credentials, usually take you less than 2 years to complete them, but that are necessary requirements for work. I group those under the beauty college paradigm in my book. And those are a little different, and the incentives that people have for attending those schools are a little different than those that are happening in what I call the technical college system, which is the sector that I think most of us were more familiar with in the mid first decade of the 2000s, because these were the ones that had all the television commercials, right? Strayer University, the University of Phoenix, Capella, and all of those. So these were programs that were starting an overreach that was historically new. They had started reaching into the 4-year degrees and beyond. They are offering graduate degrees in things like clinical psychology, and nursing and healthcare. They were offering bachelor's, master's, doctorate degrees. And the incentives for people to pursue those degrees were related to the other part, but they were not exactly the same. And the real growth in the sector, while a lot of it did happen in that beauty college sector, the real growth and the real money, the investment from the private sector, the investment from shareholders and private equity firms, the financial sector was really interested in the growth of that 4-year degree and beyond, the technical college sector, as I call it in the book.
So on one hand, we have sort of what one could consider sort of almost a vocational school. On some level. And the other is this sort of new animal that, and we're talking about Fortune 500 companies here. We're talking, right? Yes, I mean, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars per, in terms of revenue per, year on these companies. And that's really where on some level, like the action is, right? I mean, in that sector. And it's fascinating to me because you really, I mean, I'm quite familiar with sort of some of the dynamics, but you look beyond the dynamics and look at what's going on in society that sort of like bring that about. But before we get to that part, walk people through the business model of a place like one of these technical, what you call technical side schools, because it is, I don't want to say it's a criminal syndicate in my estimation, but it's close.
It is close to being the underside of financialization, which is what I would kind of think of it. It is not unlike what we saw happen in the mortgage crisis. Yep. It is not unlike what we are starting to see in the student loan debt crisis, and those things are very much related. And that is that capital looks for something to invest in. And as consumers become stretched and can't do as much consumer buying, right, what becomes profitable are the things that people have to pay for. Now, that's the social part. And so one of the things I'm looking at in the book is, why did all of a sudden everybody need or want a college degree? What was it that was so attractive to the investment class about this 4-year degree and beyond sector that made it so very profitable? That system looks like looking at what is going on in the economic system and the economic structure. Here we talk about the labor market, but also people, how comfortable or how safe people feel in the economy. What the system is really preying on is how vulnerable people feel in the labor market. Vulnerability became extremely profitable to the for-profit college sector as a solution. It positioned itself as a solution to workers who are feeling economically vulnerable in the labor market. If you thought that your wages were stagnant, which we now know to be empirically true, people's wages have stagnated over the last 25 years. If you thought your consumer purchasing power had declined, well, you weren't crazy. It had declined. But instead of responding to those things with what we maybe would have done, 40 years ago with a sort of social policy response, what we told millions of people was, this is your fault. This is because you're not competitive enough for the new jobs of the 21st century. The only way to prove that you are competitive is to get a degree and to keep pursuing credentials and degrees, and to do that at your own individual cost.
And you call this the education gospel.
That is correct. It is the gospel that says it doesn't matter what the reality of the economic relationship is, because it is predatory, as you point out. It is preying on predatory in the true sense of the word, which is that it's preying upon people's economic vulnerabilities. The education gospel says, don't worry about those details. Don't worry about what the economic relationship is or the details of the contract you're signing. Education will always pay off because it has always paid off. We were so invested in the gospel that education could never fail you that I think on the social policy and certainly on the political front, we fell down on asking tough questions about whether or not this specific type of education actually paid off for people. And what we know now is that the picture is not very good for whom that educational investment has paid off for. For-profit colleges are more expensive than most of your traditional not-for-profit college options. Students tend to bear more of the individual costs through student loans, as opposed to, say, grants and scholarships or employee benefits. They take longer to complete those programs, and as it turns out, the labor market doesn't seem to reward it in higher wages.
All right, so let's talk about We should also say that something like when you talk about the schools that you mentioned, these bigger for-profit universities, which are also predominantly online, right? We're talking about something like 95% of their tuition costs are paid via student loans from the U.S. government, right? And
legally, it's supposed to be we have this 90-10 rule, right? What for-profit colleges are held to is a standard that only up to 90% of their tuition can come from the federal student aid program, and the other 10% is supposed to come from direct tuition payments from either employers or from students. What this is supposed to do is, how this is described is a check on the school's value to the consumer. But 90%, first of all, is still extremely high, and it's only 90% in theory, because what we have found is that many schools, that doesn't include things like GI Bill money, is usually counted in that 10%. And so some institutions, when you count up all of the government subsidized payments coming to them, approach something far closer to, as you said, to the 95% coming from publicly subsidized dollars.
All right. And so give us a sense of demographically who these students tend to be, their age, their background, because they're a lot of these students are similarly situated, right? They're ambitious, but they also don't necessarily have the social the social cash or the networking to enter into what we traditional higher ed schools or be aware, or they can't afford to because they've got to take care of their children or they have other responsibilities.
Exactly. I think the real telling statistic in the for-profit college sector's demographics is in gender, actually. And in the book, I talk a lot about race, class, and gender, but I really think gender is the biggest piece because it tells, I think, exactly that story, Sam, which is this. About 68, anywhere between 68 and 74%, depending on which year you take it, and this hasn't changed much over the last 10 years, of those enrolled in the for-profit college sector are women. Right. This is really a gendered problem that I think really speaks to why people would attend these schools. People are attending them mostly because they have already been disadvantaged in the paid labor market. We know all of the general statistics and trend lines of how much more credentialed women have to be paid equal salaries in the labor market, how much more difficult it can be for them to have upward mobility into higher income positions. But we also know that bigger story that women tend to be the ones more likely to be caring for children. And when you're talking about the age range of the student, we tend to think of them as quote unquote non-traditional, but that just doesn't always necessarily mean they're older. It usually just means that they are also caring for a child. When you're talking about people in that position, they're also more likely to be caring for parents. This is a very familiar story for many of us, trapped between caring for children and caring for aging parents. And their economic position then needs to not only take care of themselves, but they are really trying to take care of a whole family, right? And so when they are having problems moving up or getting secure employment in the labor market, they are especially vulnerable to a message that sounds like this. Call today, start school tomorrow, get a degree fast, get a better paying job almost immediately, because that's the message, right? Call today, start tomorrow, change your life. Well, that's the message that would be more attractive to people for whom changing their life means changing the lives for their children, for their elderly parents, et cetera. And that's women. And then when we move from there, of those enrolled in the for-profit college sector, they are more likely to be African American, Hispanic, low-income students. That's not to say that men don't attend, and they certainly do. It's not to say that white students don't attend. But when we're looking at like the typical face, the next time your listeners are maybe looking at those commercials, it's a really good indicator when you look at who they put in the commercials. Right? They're overwhelmingly women who are talking about they're going to do their homework while their kids are asleep. That tells you who they know their ideal typical student is. And those people are particularly vulnerable to that message and are especially vulnerable to taking on student loan debt to pay for that kind of chance.
And we should say that when my understanding of it is, and walk me through this, but there's a quality that reminded me in the way that they get paid. That reminded me of working in commercial radio. The key to commercial radio was always you want to hold people over the first, the next quarter hour. If you could get them past that, and there's a dynamic in these schools that is like this based upon the schedule in which student loans are dished out. Is that right?
That is correct. So the goal of the enrollment machine that I talk about describe in the book is to get students enrolled as quickly as possible. The idea being that the more time and the more opportunity students have to reflect on their decision, the more likely you are to lose them. Right. So you wanted to get them when they called, you want them to come in immediately to sign their paperwork and to get their federal financial student aid application completed as quickly as possible. And I mean, we're talking in many cases within a week, which sounds very odd to those of us who went through like the traditional college system. So that's why I want to put some numbers on this. We're not talking weeks or months. We're talking you call on a Tuesday, you visit on a Wednesday, you're enrolled when you leave Wednesday, and your financial aid paperwork is done by that Friday. Then the next goal there is to get them started in a class as quickly as possible. Depending on when you make that phone call, what we call rolling enrollment dates are going on, meaning there's almost always a new class starting. You're rarely waiting more than 2 weeks to start in the next class. And that was important because the federal student aid system will not pay the tuition until they have what we call butt in seat, right? The student's butt needs to be in the seat. They've got to show up on that first day of class, and the attendance during that first 3 weeks of that first month of school is critically important because that's how the student is then counted for student aid purposes before the check is sent. Right. And then the money, the lion's share of that tuition enrollment comes up front. There's certainly other dollars that come as the student continues on in school, but the student is quite valuable there at the earliest part of that process for that reason.
And then the retention becomes an important metric for these schools, right? Because they want that second check.
Right. Not even so much completion, because there's no bonus for like getting the students completed. There can be a penalty for them not completing, but it is about making sure they are there through the deadline, the cutoff deadlines for the student aid payment.
And so when you were working in admissions, like what kind of data did they provide you with in terms of return on investment? That's what sort of fascinates me, because I feel like if these schools, my understanding is they take a tremendous amount of data about their students as a way of sort of like, how do we market to them? How do we keep them in the seats? How do we get them in the seats? How do we keep? And we're being metaphorical with the seats, right? Because they could theoretically be doing it online.
Right.
But what you never see is 75% of our students end up making 30% more 2 years out after graduation or some figure like that, which would be, that's the key metric, isn't it?
It is. And now this is where I kind of want to be fair. We don't actually have a good metric on that for any of higher education. The problem is it's probably less of a problem if you went to a traditional not-for-profit college, right? So we haven't had to be as dogged about that kind of data. That's actually, I think, one of the weaknesses in our data system that for-profit colleges have exploited. The fact that we have not had great data on employment returns for all students has made it pretty easy for the for-profit college sector to say, well, hey, it's not like we're falling down the job. Nobody has this data. They're right. They're just not, don't have the right motivation when they say that. We do not have excellent data on how much a student earns after they graduate. Some of that is the federal system's fault. some of that is the for-profit college sector's fault. What I will say is I talk to people who manage the marketing data at for-profit colleges, and they have better data than what is often publicly available to us about how the students are doing. It is that they are not compelled to release it, and they do not release it and use it in their marketing materials to the students. What was more common was for us to slide this disclosure agreement across to the students that the U.S. Department of Education has required for-profit colleges to do. They have to usually provide things like disclaimers about your student loan debt. They have to provide disclaimers about the graduation rates and their job placement data. But that usually looks something like this. It was usually about how much people in this type of job would earn. What they didn't usually break it out to say was, this is how much people in this job who got their degree from us have earned. So, for example, you would say, hey, I want to get a certificate in, electrical engineering. And we'd say, all right, we offer that degree program. Here's what people with an electrical engineering certificate earned last year, according to the Occupational Outlook Handbook. That's what we would tell them. But we did not separate out and break out, but this is how much students who earned their degree with us are making in said jobs. And that's a level of finesse that very few people have to push back against a college to ask for that level of detail. And
you say that you're convinced that these institutions, as it were, have data on what the return on investment is, at least to some extent. And I mean, I think it's fairly obvious that if it was gangbusters, we'd know about it. Right?
Yeah, that's what I've always said to them. If it's great, awesome, right? You should definitely lead with that information. I've certainly said the same thing.
Right.
And there are some smaller programs and some for-profit colleges that do extremely well, often because they are attached to other type of arrangements, right? They have a direct line, for example, they're training people to work at AT&T, and AT&T has agreed to hire X amount of people. But those are anomalies for the most part. Most of the students who are going through these sort of generalized degree programs are relying on employers to decide whether or not their degree means something. And because of that, they're usually competing with people who have degrees from other places, and their wages often do not look comparable. And I suspect that if most for-profit colleges had data that says that they were doing that significantly better than average, they would certainly advertise it.
I would imagine even if they're doing average, they would advertise it, is my guess. But I mean, I'm not a marketing guy, so I don't know. But and we should say, I mean, just to be fair, I've heard of some programs where you come in and they will your fee, you don't even pay until you make back a certain percentage of your income. I mean, there are programs that are set up better, and I think some of these, I think folks associated with it are striving to, in certain instances. I mean, give me a sense of what the people working there, how much was your awareness as you were sitting there saying, this seems a little weird that we're not talking about a return on investment, which is why everybody walking through the door is here, right? That is. At a not-for-profit school, some schools, some liberal arts schools, people are there for citizen, I want to be a better citizen, or, I don't have to worry about my finances or whatever it is. But clearly, most of the people walking through that door are like, I'm here because in 2 years, I want to be making 30% more than I'm making today.
Right. And that is absolutely fair. I mean, the for-profit colleges themselves say of their marketing data that the number one reason that their prospective students and enrolled students tell them that they enrolled in school or sought out school with them, it was to earn more money immediately, right? So that, I mean, the students tend to be making a very sort of rational economic exchange when they attend a for-profit college in a way that is less true in traditional, especially on-campus four-year degree programs, that we have this sort of broader, like you said, liberal arts mission, and where the value of college can then be a bit more subjective. I remember feeling that, I had gone to traditional colleges myself, as did a few of my colleagues there in the enrollment office. So we knew it was different than our own experience. And I remember being troubled by it, and I talk a little about that in the book, but having absolutely no words for describing why I was uncomfortable, right? So these words about things like, social inequality and, who can make take on the opportunity cost of sitting out the labor market to go back to school. None of us had that language. I will say some of us were less concerned with it than others, but I do like to point out, I think everybody there, save for a few sort of extreme cases, fundamentally thought that the education gospel worked. And so if we were offering an opportunity for people to better themselves, if it was costing them a lot of money, that was still better than nothing. Where it did get stickier is that there were admissions people who would say things like, I myself would not go to college this way, right? I wouldn't go to school here, or I wouldn't allow my children to go to school here. But this is still a good option for quote unquote other people. And that's where I thought when people felt uncomfortable or were wrestling with those ideas, that's where it usually manifested.
Okay. And this is, that's fascinating because I think there is this sort of quality of like, I don't know, both an ignorance to the sort of the reality of what's being offered and sort of a predisposition to presume there's nothing else that can be done for these folks.
Right.
And that is let's talk a little bit about that part, because the Obama administration started to crack down on some of this by basically saying you're not eligible for student loans. And correct me if I'm wrong on this, but you're not eligible for student loans unless you use specific accrediting companies or certain accrediting values, and they said to, I think it was Corinthian and ITT, like your accreditor, that's not real. We don't buy it. And then their loans dried up and their business dried up overnight and they had to close. But that was insufficient because why?
Well, it doesn't solve the big problem, right? So, we can think of this in our own lives. The grocery store closing down, the grocery store you really like closest to your home closes down. It doesn't solve the problem that you need groceries, right? The real root of the problem was the demand, not the supply. And I would point out about these schools that did rely significantly on federal student aid dollars. And once they lose their accreditation, you tend to lose then your ability to offer student aid. And that's pretty much the end of usually any for-profit college school, as it would, to be fair, for all schools. But the accreditation piece, the Obama administration was becoming more particular about the data they were requiring the for-profit college to provide to judge whether or not they were meeting the threshold of providing a quality education. Now, the for-profit colleges, I should say, debate to the death whether or not that's a fair assessment of them, whether they should be held to that standard or not, and whether the metric is fair. But that is what the Obama administration was doing. What I will say is that what the Obama administration, and really what no administration has done in quite some time, is really wrestle, however, with that bigger problem. There was this recent report that just came out a couple months ago, I think from the Center for American Progress, that said the job skills myth, the job skills have been a myth, right? Yep. Well, that's all I was writing about, what many of us have been writing about for some time, that what we have been telling people, the social inequality problem in the labor market was not about people not having the right skills. And instead of solving that problem and being honest in our political rhetoric to say this is not about employers not having the right skills. This is about employers not wanting to pay fair wages. This is about us not holding employers to task for their tax responsibility. There was a lot at play. And I will say that nobody had really hit on the political rhetoric that I think solved the problem of demand. And that was why for-profit colleges remain somewhat popular with people. Demand has not dried up because there's still a demand for a good quality of life with good wages. And they're still making that promise.
And we should. I want to be really explicit about this so people understand. So the myth was that there was a mismatch in our workforce with their education, and all the research now shows. A big report came out very recently, and I think it was from the Center for Economic Progress. But I'm not. Regardless, regardless, it basically showed that in fact what was happening is, as it became more of a buyer's market for employers, they just got more narrow in what they would accept from people rather than certain skill sets being needed. But we're also talking about people who are already employed more often than not, right? When you're going to these schools.
That's right.
These are people who just want to get better wages and be able to care for their families. So we have not so much of a lack of employment situation, but rather poor pay for people who are doing decent work. And,
that is right.
And so we had this. I mean, on some level, I feel like the educational story in this sector is not terribly different than when we see education in the context of K through 12, insofar as we're looking at schools to deal with societal ills that are really not in their portfolio.
That is correct. And that is really the big story and the tougher story, frankly, right? People don't like the story. When I say people, it's, I think it's hard for politicians. I think it's hard for policy people to get a good story. We're just so deeply invested in the narrative. But the real story here is that it is not just possible, but now I think we can empirically argue that it is true that colleges cannot, and school K through 12 or K through 16 cannot solve these larger social ills. That the real problem of wages was never about the human capital of the workers working in jobs. And so when you told people that story, all you did was make them very valuable to the financial sector, who were able to exploit that fear by selling credentials. But that does not solve the problem that what workers are really facing is a really tough path to not just a good job, but what we would call internal mobility, the promotions over time, for your wages to increase over time. When you work at a job and after 5 years that you should be earning more than when you started. Those kinds of problems are not human capital problems.
And we should say, I mean, it's interesting what's implicated here, because the access to government loans clearly drove up the prices of these places, right? Because they're just they're basically fixing their tuition as a function of that 90-10 rule. Like we're going to make our tuition cost 10% more than whatever is available for people in terms of government loans. And that dynamic, of course, would be fixed and in many respects reversed if we, instead of having a massive loan program, we provided at least one or two free options per state, but that's maybe a separate issue. But I want to...
No, I don't think it's a separate issue. I actually think it's a super important one, Sam. It's one of the ones that I argue for, that the real competition, we thought that the competition that needed to happen in the higher education, quote unquote, market was that you needed more institutions. And that's what we saw happen from the 1990s to 2010s, when we created tons of new institutions. But as long as the student aid system is underwriting all of those institutions the same, that's not actually creating more competition. They would just increase the size of the pie and just take in more students. That's what the for-profit college sector really was. Real competition would come through true, accessible, affordable options. And the only people who can do that, the only entity that can do that is the state. And so I actually believe that's the real solution.
Interesting. And so let me ask you this, and just as we broaden this out, because I want to just touch on your, and I will confess to not having read Thick yet, but I will also say it is right on the top of my list of things to read. How
that's acceptable.
All right, I appreciate that. Thank you for that. But I mean, how the issues that you talk about in Thick, I mean, to the extent that I know what it's about, is addressing your experience largely, and also I think the experience of other people who are within our society, who are in folks who are similarly positioned, who may be targeted because they're the most vulnerable, particularly when they feel this pressure economically, or by race, or by gender. Draw the connective tissue between these two books for me.
Yeah, that's a great question, actually, because to me, the connective tissue was always there. And I laugh sometimes when I did have to do this with the publisher, going, no, to me, this is all part of the same story, when they asked me to sort of position the book. In many ways, my thinking about lower ed started with asking a very basic question, which was, wow, a lot of these for-profit colleges have a lot of Black women enrolled. Why is that? And by starting from there, you got to all of these larger issues, not because there was something unique about Black women, but there was something unique about when a predatory system is built, it almost always starts with the most vulnerable people in a society. That's how predation works. And so if for-profit colleges were a predatory economic arrangement, which I argue that they are, it made sense that it would start by serving parts of the population that were poorly served by other institutions. So that means women and people of color disproportionately. So my questions start there. And one of the larger arguments of the new collection of essays where, I take that through looking at technology, I take it by looking at popular culture and policy and media, is that story is true over and over again. And that what we learn when you pay attention to who is most vulnerable in the system, you understand the system better. One of the reasons why I think I was able to write Lower Ed and it hadn't been written before by someone else is that you do get a clarity about how a system is working when you look at its weakest points, right? So I was able to say, look, there's something here about the relationship between student loan money and economic insecurity and labor market changes. There has to be something here because look at what's happening with this subset of people. And in many ways, all I'm saying across this collection of essays is that reveals a lot of important information about our system, no matter what part of the system that we're looking at.
To what extent do Black women in particular, because, you note that they are in many respects the most, or at least one of the groups that is most susceptible to these type of predatory, specifically because they're not being served by other institutions.
Right.
To what extent is there an awareness of that as a systemic problem? And I ask only because I've talked to people who've done ethnographies of people who've lost their homes in foreclosure in the wake of the foreclosure crisis. And there wasn't necessarily a big understanding that their experience was not unique, that it wasn't a function of the decisions that they had made, but rather it was a function of decisions that had been made by people they didn't know. What is your sense of that of the awareness of those folks as being in this predicament because of the system rather as opposed to decisions that they have made?
Yeah, I think that just overall, we have a real paucity of language to talk about system thinking, right, in our culture. And we see this over and over again when we talk about, who are these stupid people who signed up for these bad loans, right? And then it'll take us 10 years of excavating the whole mess to find out that one didn't need to be stupid. One needed to just be there and need a home because there was all of this other stuff happening around them that foreclosed upon good decisions, right? It's not that people are often just making the poorest decision available. It's that lots of decisions are foreclosed upon for you. The reality is, if you want to, for example, go to college in the United States of America today, it helps a lot if you have always had people who are pushing you to go to college, if you had access to well-funded, equitable K-12 schools, if you had access to a safe, secure home in a safe neighborhood, if you had good nutrition, and then if you could make it to the finish line with a high school diploma, knowing about all of your college options and have all of the money and the time in the world to apply. Well, those types of decisions, if you're 24 and you didn't have those things, nothing about your decision-making at 24 is going to override the 23 years that preceded that year, right?
Right.
Those certain options are foreclosed upon for you. And that's what I mean about systematic thinking and thus not having a really good language to talk about it in popular culture. It is an easier story to write to say, oh, X person, right? Lisa decided X and look at how horrible her life is. That's an easier story to write than it is to write this big, sprawling story. But that's where the reality is and where we can usually affect the most change by understanding why do some people have some options and not others.
Right. But I wonder how much of an awareness is there of that within amongst, let's say, Black women. that it is.
Yeah. I don't know that we are different than most Americans in that we don't have much language to talk about that either. I think one of the stunning things that came out to me in the interviews I did for lower ed was how many of the students absolutely blamed themselves. Even when we would then talk in detail about, their biography and what had brought them there. And this just shows up in lots of social science work over and over again. Poor people, for example, writ large, tend to blame themselves for their own poverty. Right. Over and over again, we see that kind of language. And I think that's precisely because Black women, like most people in this country, just don't have a language to talk about the system's thinking. And if we look around, there are not a lot of politicians, certainly, who are good at talking about it.
Well,
I don't know that a lot of
there are plenty of politicians. At the very least, we have at the very least one party that is completely 100% committed to making the argument that it is a failure of personal responsibility. Right. But the fact is that, the Democratic Party, even Barack Obama, the idea of personal responsibility, took the forefront a lot more than any notion of a systemic failure.
Absolutely. I take that to task actually quite a bit in an essay in the new book about the Barack Obama administration was not a departure from that language. No. He embraced wholeheartedly the idea of, cultures of poverty that create people who abdicate responsibility for themselves. And I want to be clear that, of course, there's always some individual choice. And of course, there's always individual agency. What I argue and what lots of people like me have argued is that we overstate how much that can change people's circumstances, while completely obscuring all of the structural stuff. There's, like you said, one party who is just ideologically opposed to the idea of a system or structure. And then on the other side, there's a party who has to sometimes give lip service to it, but that increasingly feels the need, because they're chasing some mythical center party, center voter, feels the need to double down on the idea of personal responsibility. So we really don't have a political party, a major political party, that is dedicated to using very precise language about some of the horrible predatory behaviors that happen to us in our systems.
Tressie McMillan Cottom, author of Lower Ed, The Troubling Rise of For-Profit Colleges in the New Economy, and Thick, and other essays. I want to have you back on after I read the Thick. I hope you'll make it.
I will do that. I'm going to hold you to it, in fact, Sam.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really great stuff. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
All right, folks. Going to take a quick break, head into the fun half of the program. Want to remind you again, Joybird. Check it out. Joybird.com/majority. Joybird offers a one-of-a-kind furniture made to your unique tastes. You can turn your ideas into reality with hundreds of styles and options, from mid-century modern to contemporary classics, all of which are customizable in an amazing array of fabric choices, including kid and pet-friendly upholstery options. See how Joybird is revolutionizing online furniture shopping. Create the furniture that brings you joy today at joybird.com/majority. Go to joybird.com/majority. Receive an exclusive offer of 25% off your first order by using the code majority. Just a reminder, this program relies on your support. It's our members who make this show possible every day. We get some advertising, not a tremendous amount. We're working on getting more. We try. But when you become a member, not only are you supporting the free show, we give you extra content every day. You don't have to listen to it every day. You can listen to it one day a week, the extra content. You can mix and match. I don't want to listen to the first half of the show today. I want to listen to the second half. People sometimes, I just want to listen to the middle part of the show. And I have that option because I have the first and the second half. Plus, it comes to you commercial free. So check it out. Join themajorityreport.com. Also, justcoffee.coop. Fair trade coffee, tea, or chocolate. Use the coupon code majority. Get 10% off. Michael, last night was Tuesday. I'm not sure if you were aware of that. But in the event that you were, what happened?
Drinks were had. There was a major mess in here that we sort of dealt with, hopefully.
I don't doubt it. Don't doubt it.
No, I'm just kidding. None of that happened. I like how Matt was
Bathroom
like, wait, did I miss out?
Bathroom was
Like I was completely oblivious to the mess.
Daniel Bessner and I talked about what a left-wing foreign policy looks like if, say, there's an example in a Sanders presidency. We touched on the breakthrough of the Michelle Alexander column on Palestine, the launching of a Free Lula movement, Corey Pine on the RSS BJP. We connected that Tucker clip with a broader history of MLK and COINTELPRO. A lot of stuff happened. The post game for patrons, I think we gave you the right map for how to handle and respond to the Harris candidacy and reminded everybody of just what total trash Joe Biden is. Patreon.com/TMBS. Get your tickets to the live show.
Jamie, on the Intifada.
So out today, folks, we have the second ever edition of History is a Weapon, featuring a special guest, Matt Chrisman of Chapo Trap House. I can say who it is now. And in this special episode, Sean and Matt go over why, this question, why, of all advanced capitalist countries, is the United States unique in its historical failure to form a bona fide labor/socialist party that is organically tied to the union movement as an institutionalized political expression of working class interests? The answer may surprise you. Also, sorry, what?
Go ahead.
Also, Sean and I went on Alex Patak's weird anime podcast. It's called Ballin' Out Super. We talked about our childhoods, anime, and Marilyn Manson. So that's
Very
pretty
strange.
weird. If there's any crossover between people into leftist politics and anime, I'm told that there is. Check it out.
For some reason, I laughed when I said the Antifada because I remembered Brandon
Straka.
Like,
What is that?
Wait, that girl has what? She's with the Intifada?
You were just apathetically steamrolling over his gotcha question.
Yeah, it was.
It's a combination of Antifada and Intifada, Brandon.
Man, he really could have reached for lavender at any number of moments in that
It's true.
exchange. That was a disaster.
Literary Hangover, The House of the Seven Gables, probably the best Nathaniel Hawthorne novel. It's about a corrupt politician. I also get into how the Whig Party was sort of a zombie version of the Federalist Party that had to stop being explicitly pro-aristocracy. So there's some interesting parallels. I mean, obviously the Democrats and Whigs don't perfectly match up to modern conservative or modern Democrats and Republicans, but there's some interesting through lines.
That is interesting. I just got to say, I know we're going to go in the fun half and we'll talk about this, but like this is happening really fast in Venezuela. The major military figure has just defected, who was head of Chavez's presidential guard, has defected to the opposition, and basically, we're encouraging the head of the assembly, this guy Guaido, to just say he's president and affirm his presidency. So we're basically mid-coup. And Ro Khanna is the only Democrat in Congress so far to criticize this. So we got to give props to Ro for continuing to speak on these types of issues.
I would bet you that a full 80% of the members of Congress
don't even know what's happening.
Aren't even
right
aware
now.
of it.
I agree. Although now they're starting to tweet it at, frankly. So they're not going to have that excuse much longer.
I saw Eva Gollinger say something about they're kind of waiting on the U.S. to basically announce it. So this could be a coup by a Trump tweet.
This could be literally a coup by a Trump tweet, definitely. And this has been coordinated with the Bolsonaro regime. And, of course, this is all coming on the heels of confirmation that the gang that killed Marielle Franco might be literally in business relationships with Bolsonaro's family.
Well, a coincidence. I'm sure it's a coincidence.
I'm sure whatever it is, it's good for Wall Street.
And the I guess the good news is it doesn't look like we're going to be invading.
No,
until after we need to be brought in for peacekeeping, right?
Yeah,
is that basically the way that works?
Yeah, we'll see.
So
all of the problems that are legitimate about Maduro are going to be worse by like a combination of like cartel military defectors and U.S. backed austerity bots.
Right.
Like There's nothing that's not going to get worse.
But it's going to be done in service of essentially the IMF principles.
IMF,
right?
World Bank principles, and getting U.S. oil companies totally back encumbered. By the way, Venezuela's oil was made public well before Chavez, and his critique was not the oil was already not privatized. He just said, we're going to take this public oil and distribute it for healthcare and education. And that's what's going to get
the cash.
We're going to take the cash from what is already a public resource and invest it in people, and that's going to be first on the chopping block with this.
Yeah. So the suffering of the Venezuelan people will not end, but it will come for a greater good, and that is to enrich the wealthiest in that society, and no longer, a big part of the problem has been essentially the way that they what was happening with their currency, and largely because we had shut off their opportunities to engage in the international financial system. And so you ended up having a tremendous amount of, I don't even know if I would call it corruption as much as thievery, because it opened up the opportunity for people to steal large amounts of money from the Venezuelan government and from different agencies. So this will, you got to wonder if this will even make the news.
Will make Fox News because it will fit into their narrative.
But I would be surprised if there is more than 30 seconds on this
on TV
on
news.
Cable
Well,
news.
here's an angle. Ava Gollinger just tweeted this, and this is very possible, and this will get it into the MSNBC matrix, which is it's possible right now that Venezuela might have two governments, one recognized by Russia and China, and another recognized by the United States. So if there's some type of Russia angle, I could imagine. Go Russia.
Right. It's possible.
Yeah, it's like, but it won't fit then because if according to that narrative, Trump would then have to be like, Maduro's a great guy. I just got off the phone with Putin.
Exactly.
My mistake. He should be back in control of the presidency.
Putin released me on this one. This is a vote I can make.
Yeah. Putin's like, I understand Monroe Doctrine imperialism.
Right.
Go for it.
Go.
So how would
I get the next one?
How would, say, a President Bernie deal with this situation as a left internationalist?
He could have already stopped sanctioning members, starting to strangle the Venezuelan economy. Like, that would have been the first step. I mean, he easily could have been in a position, in fact, a better position to stop strangling the economy and say, actually, I share a lot of your goals, and you need to stop messing up in X, Y, and Z, and I'll do direct above-board diplomacy about it. I mean, that one would be easy. Stop by interfering.
Stop creating the problem.
Precisely.
What a concept.
All right. We got to head into the fun half. 646-257-3920 is the number. See you in the fun half.